This wave of protests that we've seen recently in Latin America, really, while each case differs, we've seen a wave of protests in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Chile now, also even Uruguay and Mexico, some in Haiti. The reasons differ somewhat, but there are some common threads across all of them. And in large part, in terms of the common threads, what we saw during the early 2000s until about 2014 was a massive boom in their economies, commodities boom that really cooled off. And with that boom came the growth of the middle class, but also rising expectations about more accountable politics, about so that the economic growth could continue indefinitely, and about improving services. And when that economic growth cooled, and the IMF predicts that in 2019, the region will grow at only a rate of 0.6%, so a considerable decline from, say, 6 or 7% growth only less than a decade ago. We're seeing these rising expectations meet these real serious structural problems in the economy and in politics, and people are rising up in protest, often sparked by things that are a little bit more day-to-day, but they have deeper roots in people's expectations and economic structural dysfunction. Well, there's been a little bit of mismanagement that's driving this unrest. For many countries, there was a sense that when the boom continued, that there'd be enough for everyone. And as that pie began to shrink, people realized that a lot of the money was spent both in corruption, but also in projects that simply didn't help grow the economy in any sustainable way. Most of the economies in places like Chile and Bolivia and Ecuador are driven by large corporations, and there really hasn't been this breakthrough of small to medium enterprises or that fostering of that business environment that's necessary to soak up new employment and, as a result, really provide opportunities for people to move out of poverty or even a sustainable status within the middle class. Well, most of the governments in their response have at first tried to be a little dismissive. I think part of this, and this is part of the problem too, is we're looking at a very entrenched political class in many of these cases. People are demanding accountability. In the case of Chile, it's been the same political class pretty much since the transition to democracy in 1989. 30 years, it's remained pretty much entrenched. And so in the case of Haiti, the president is very reluctant to step down. In the case of Bolivia, President Evo Morales was running for what is an unconstitutional fourth term, and looks very much like he may have stolen the election, or at least stolen the first round of the elections, and we saw the protests erupt. But again, these protests are being driven largely by pent-up frustrations over the economy and over and politics, but they're just sort of hitting the fan, if you will, around bread and butter daily issues, or the case of Bolivia elections. Unfortunately, in the U.S.'s response and its policy towards Latin America, it's been really lacking. The U.S.'s typical response in Latin America has been development assistance and trade. But under the Trump administration, largely driven by electoral politics in Florida, what we're seeing is an obsessive focus on what John Bolton called the troika of tyranny: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. These are indeed repressive states. They do need to be addressed. But that has been the overwhelming emphasis in the Washington, D.C.'s policy towards the region at a time when citizens' frustrations across the board are rising up, and those need to be addressed too. And so they've focused on these repressive states to the exclusion of many of our best stable partners: Chile, Argentina, Mexico, instead of really worrying about this ferment, if you will, of discontent that we're seeing now bubbling up.